Happy Families Podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Small things that wouldn't ordinarily disrupt you or knock you off your feet are doing that right now. So there's sort of the emotional component of COVID fatigue, but then there's also the very physical component.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
G'day, this is Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the author of 6 books about how to make your family happier. Here with Kylie, I said my mum, my wife and mum to our 6 kids. If I said that wrong, it sounds like you're my wife and mum. That sounds really bad.
Really bad.
I need to make sure I slow that down when we do this in future, just in case anyone gets confused. Today we're joined by somebody. I'm very, very excited to have a guest as we work through a week all about COVID and how we can help our family to navigate the highs and, well, particularly the lows of lockdowns. We've got still almost half the country in lockdown. It's been ongoing. It's only getting worse. And we're talking with Professor Lee Waters. Professor Waters, Lee is at the Centre for Wellbeing at the Graduate School of Education in the University of Melbourne. I'm an honorary fellow there, and I'm just delighted to talk to her. Oh, by the way, 27 years as a psychologist, written a book for parents called The Strength Switch, which we will talk about in just a minute as well. Great book to help parents to use positive psychology to help their kids to flourish. And Lee joins us right now. It's so nice to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Justin keeps telling me the data is suggesting that lockdowns are having a huge impact on mental health everywhere. What are you seeing in the data?
Yeah, look, the data is not telling us a pretty story at the moment, and no one will be surprised who's listening to this to hear that living in a global pandemic, COVID-19 crisis has really had a very dramatic impact on the mental health of our kids, the people who we love the most, and national research coming out to show that levels of depression, anxiety and stress are elevated by up to 60% in young Australians. Well, that's particularly kind of in teenagers and early adult Australians. Research also showing that at the start of the global pandemic, so think back to kind of like rewind to March last year, national research with teens asking, about their confidence to cope. And at that point in time, 80% of Australian teenagers said, I'm confident that I can cope with this. Now we've got 30% of teenagers saying, I'm confident I can cope with this. So they're sort of dealing with that extended adversity and that ongoing uncertainty is really taking its toll on the mental health of our teenagers. Drops in hope by 30%. And I've mentioned some stats around teenagers. We go to the early years, sort of thinking of parents at home with kids below 5, and large national research study done last year with a couple of universities. My own university, the University of Melbourne, was included in that. And what that research found was that the elevated levels of things like issues with sleeping, anger, anxiety, behavioural and emotional problems. And again, it's getting worse. So the first round of that survey in kind of mid, I suppose, May last year, about 22% of parents were saying my young child is struggling. And when that data was completed again towards the end of that last year, that went up to about 42%. What's really telling actually about that data for the younger kids, and I think it would be very similar if you're a parent listening with a primary school age child or a teen, is that at that particular point in time, when the second wave was done, that was when Melbourne was in its very elongated lockdown. I'm from Melbourne myself, so I'm getting used to living at home in lockdown working at home with my hubby, working at home with my 2 teenage kids. But what that research found in the younger kids is that for the Victorian segment of the sample, depression went up by 21% compared to the other children in the national study who hadn't had that elongated lockdown. And behavioural and emotional issues were 5 times more prevalent in the young Victorian kids who were dealing with this long extended lockdown, second round of lockdown, compared to children across the other states and territories in the national survey. So that was research from last year. Most of the research always has a time lag, right? So what will be really kind of interesting to see is what's going to happen at the end of 2021 when so many families across Australia, as you just said, Justin, approximately half of the families in Australia are really dealing with that multiple rounds of lockdown, ongoing adversity, extended uncertainty.
Yeah, and the severity, and that's just the kids. I mean, I'm looking at research on parents and also getting the full frontal assault via our social media and our email and working with our members via Happy Families and the parents. There's this low grade, this low level agitation, frustration. I mean, this is hard for parents as well.
So hard. And I think that's so important to raise, is that, as parents, our roles have multiplied and amplified and extended, particularly parents who are listening to this, who are in lockdown right now, where we're being both parents and teachers. And if we're working, trying to be a good employee at the same time. And what I've seen in my work with parents is, I like the term you said, that kind of low-level agitation. What I'm seeing is a lot of what I'm calling COVID fatigue. Yeah. And COVID fatigue can come about in different ways for different people. So there can be those kind of emotional symptoms of being agitated, having that kind of mood swing. So waking up in the morning and thinking, yeah, it's okay, it's going to be a good day. And sort of by lunchtime feeling very, very differently. So those mood swings, that emotional fragility where small things that wouldn't ordinarily disrupt you or knock you off your feet are doing that right now. So there's sort of the emotional component of COVID fatigue, but then there's also the very physical component of COVID fatigue. And that is just genuinely that, we're tired, we're fatigued, we're not sleeping well. The stress is playing out in our bodies. So, lots of joint aches, lower back problems, shoulder problems, neck problems, headaches. So that COVID fatigue is what I'm really seeing in a lot of parents.
Lee, you and I share a background in positive psychology. My PhD was in pos psych. You've been working in this area and are a global leader in the field. You and I both know that it can be helpful, as does Kylie, because she's watched us implement it in our home. As you've mentioned, you've done it with your two daughters. But I know that as we steer the conversation now towards your research and what positive psychology can do to help boost well-being in families, we're going to talk about some ideas like gratitude or using strengths or whatever it might be. And I just know that there's going to be some cynics who are going to roll their eyes and say, really, you're going to tell me to talk about grateful things around the dining table tonight with my kids, and that's going to make a difference when we are feeling the way we're feeling? How do you respond to the skeptics on an issue that is so tricky like this?
Firstly, I completely understand where they're coming from. But what I will say is that, and this is certainly, we can talk about the science of positive psychology, but it's also kind of what our grandparents told us. It's like common sense, which is control the controllables. And so we can't control a global pandemic. We can't control decisions made around lockdown. We can't control many of the things, but as parents, there are some things that we can, and I'm calling it control with a little c instead of control with a capital C. There are some things that we can control to help change the brain chemistry of our children. And so they can only be those small things. Never underestimate the power of something small. And so, like you said, focusing, acknowledging the distress that your kids are going through, being their emotional companion, being there in that moment for them first. And, you just mentioned I have two teenagers, one boy, one girl at home. And they're, we're in Melbourne, multiple lockdowns, they're stressed, they're frustrated, they're tired, they miss their friends. So always start with that emotional acknowledgement, always start with where your kids are at. But then use some of these positive psychology techniques to get us to focus on the cuddle with the dog or the sunshine or a nice meal for that night or a Netflix series that we're all watching together, because those small little things change our brain chemistry. And when our brain chemistry is changed, we view the world differently.
After the break, we're going to find out exactly what some of those things are so that we can help your family to feel happier even in the midst of this stress.
It's the Happy Families Podcast.
Imagine a home where discipline got results without anyone having to feel bad or in trouble. The Do's and Don'ts of Discipline is a webinar to help parents set limits with love, compassion and humanity. Find it now at happyfamilies.com.au/shop.
It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. And today we're speaking with Professor Lee Waters. She's from the University of Melbourne. And we're talking about the challenges that people are experiencing through the lockdown and what we can do to help.
Lee, you published a very, very popular research paper just in the last few months about what positive psychology can teach us, help us with, get us through in terms of the pandemic. Can you summarise some of those main themes and let's make it really practical, what a parent's supposed to do based on the cutting-edge science of wellbeing?
Okay, I love that question. Now you've asked a scientist to talk briefly. All right.
Sorry.
So let me accept that challenge. Look, there were a couple of really key things that came out of that paper. Three key themes that I think are very relevant for us as parents, and they were eco-connection, self-compassion, and meaning. So what the science shows us is that if we're able to get out into green, right, just green, full stop. All right, so some people are lucky they live near sort of wildlife, nature reserves, bushy areas, or just to walk around your neighbourhood or get out into your back garden if you are fortunate enough to have a back garden, or plants, bring some plants indoors. So eco-connection, the science of eco-connection shows that the minute we're in touch with nature, it changes our physiology. So it calms our nervous system down, it oxygenates our blood, and it's also a little bit of a mental vacation, if you like, a bit of an emotional holiday. All right, let's just go for a walk. That's a little bit tricky when you're in the midst of lockdown in Melbourne and in Sydney, where we have 1 hour that we're allowed out of our house. So utilize that hour, get your kids to have eco-connection, get them out into the environment, listen to the sounds of birds. When we hear birds, our auditory cortex triggers, again, it talks to our nervous system and says, everything's going to be okay. So that's the first thing that I would say. Get your kids out get them outside, eco-connection. Second thing was self-compassion. And so compassion is the ability to watch someone suffer and the wish to want to alleviate that suffering. And so self-compassion is the same thing. It's actually acknowledging your suffering in the first place. Like, I'm struggling today, I'm tired. I don't know why I'm tired. I had a pretty good sleep, but I've woken up fatigued. I'm short-tempered. I'm putting on weight. I snapped at my kids. So yes, I'm struggling. So witness the struggling, and then compassion is the ability to witness struggling and seek to alleviate it. So seek to alleviate it. Talk kindly to yourself. Explain to yourself that we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Something like this hasn't happened for 100 years. It's hard to parent during this time. Have a hot bath. Take yourself out into nature. Forgive yourself for not being the perfect parent right now. And what the research also shows is the more that we model self-compassion, that is being kind to ourselves when we're struggling instead of being harsh and impatient with ourselves, the more that we do that, we're modeling that to our kids. They all need to learn that right now too, that they need to learn to witness, I'm struggling, I'm suffering right now, I'm tired, I miss my friends. And, self-compassion is kind of like the reverse of the golden rule, or the extension of the golden rule. The golden rule is do unto others what you would do to yourself. And self-compassion, we're always kind to other people. Self-compassion is do to yourself what you would do to others. Be kind to ourselves right now. So that's the second thing. The third thing is meaning. And so, you would know this, Justin, there's a lot of work on if we can understand sort of the bigger picture and have a sense of meaning and purpose in our life, that's like a key formula for good mental health. And so right now, in the midst of a global pandemic with all this uncertainty, how can you help your kids find that sense of meaning and find that sense of purpose? And it may be that it's through particular functions they're playing in the family role. Maybe you've got a child and it's their job to set up all the technology for you. So they've got that sense of purpose. They've got a role. Maybe you've got a child who's very kind-hearted. And so their meaning and their purpose is to check out and reach out to their friends and check on family members and have a Zoom session with their grandparents. And maybe you've got other friends or kids who, just good at doing research. And so their kind of sense of meaning and purpose is to say, well, I'll go and research where we can do our online shopping, or I'll research how other countries have gotten through this global pandemic. And so really tuning into the strengths of your kids and giving them a sense of meaning and purpose, giving them a role that they play in the midst of a global pandemic. I'm not sure if that was a short answer, but they're the three key things that I'd say.
So, Lee, you wrote a book a few years ago now called The Strength Switch. It's about how when kids tap into their strengths, it elevates well-being. Can you talk about strengths in the current context and how families can build on their strengths right now?
Yeah, look, every child has their own strengths, and now is an opportunity for us to tune into those. So strengths are things that energize your child, that your child kind of performs naturally without having to think about, will learn quickly. And so if you think about strengths like kindness, that's really a good strength to have in the middle of a global pandemic. Maybe you've got a child who has the strength of humor, and they just have that capacity to make us kind of laugh at the absurdity of what we're going through. Maybe you have a child who has creativity, and so they're able to like reorganize your house in a way that suits lockdown. So it's really about tuning into what works well for your child, what are their unique assets, where do they get energy from, and capitalizing on those right now.
I love the idea of the creative child reorganizing the house. You said that like it was a good thing, Lee. I'm thinking that but if my creative child was given free rein to do that, I don't think we'd feel so good about life. Lee, there is so much more that we could talk about. I could listen to you talk for hours. This has been a delightful conversation. If people want more information, where can they find you and your book, The Strength Switch?
Well, thanks, Justin. It's been great to talk to you and Kylie. And yeah, look, check me out on my website. So that's Lee, and my name is actually spelled Lea. So think of T or Meadow Lee, leewaters.com. On all the socials, it's @prof for professor, @prof Lee Waters.
Thanks, Lee.
Well, what a great conversation. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. And if you'd like more information about making your family happier, obviously check out Lee's book, The Strength Switch, or you can visit happyfamilies.com.au.